ruptures, alliance breakdowns, and attachment processes are understood in current research, not simply as a lack of technique, but as disruptions in relational safety and attunement, leading to relational breakdown, stagnation, and possible therapy failure. Hi, I'm Brooke, and welcome to If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship, a podcast exploring the relational foundations of psychotherapy through the lenses of attachment theory, trauma-informed care, person-centered therapy, and current research. Today's episode explores a subject that the mental health field often struggles to discuss openly. What happens when therapy fails? Not simply when progress is slow, or not simply when healing takes time, but when the therapeutic relationship itself begins to deteriorate. Because culturally, therapy is often presented as inherently safe, a protected environment, a healing space where growth naturally unfolds if someone is willing to do the work. But therapy is not immune to human limitation. At its core, therapy is still a deeply vulnerable human relationship. And like all human relationships, it is susceptible to misunderstanding, rigidity, emotional neglect, misattunement, and relational breakdown. Research consistently shows that therapy rarely fails because a therapist forgot a textbook intervention or selected the wrong worksheet. More often, therapy fails through breakdowns in relational safety, responsiveness, and repair. And this matters because the therapeutic alliance is not simply the backdrop for treatment. It is the treatment. When the relationship itself becomes emotionally unsafe, invalidating, rigid, or unresponsive, the therapy room can slowly transform from a site of healing into a site of reenactment. And often this collapse happens quietly, not through dramatic ethical violations, but through hundreds of small moments where a client begins feeling unseen, emotionally abandoned, chronically misunderstood, or relationally alone. One of the findings within psychotherapy research is that many therapists significantly overestimate their effectiveness. In multiple clinician self-report studies, therapists consistently rate themselves as above average in clinical skill and therapeutic success, a statistical impossibility on a large scale. At the same time, therapy dropout rates across settings remain remarkably high. Some studies estimate premature termination rates ranging anywhere from 15 to 50%, depending on the population and treatment setting. So this creates an important question. Why is there often such a large gap between the therapist's perception of therapy and the client's experience of it? Part of the answer lies in what some researchers describe as therapist self-schema. Every therapist enters the room with their own internal templates for understanding people, emotion, conflict, attachment, trauma, culture, and change. These schemas operate largely outside of conscious awareness. And when they become rigid, therapists may unknowingly filter client experiences through their own assumptions instead of truly seeing the person in front of them. The therapist may subtly impose their own worldview, attachment style, communication preferences, or emotional comfort zone onto the client, which can lead to chronic misattunement. The client may technically be heard, but not deeply understood. And over time, repeated misattunement creates a painful relational atmosphere where clients begin feeling, you don't actually see me. You only understand the version of me that fits your framework. There's no room for my actual experience here. This is where therapy can begin drifting toward emotional neglect, not always intentional neglect, but relational neglect nonetheless. Because emotional neglect in therapy often occurs not through cruelty, but through chronic failures of responsiveness. Research on hindering events offers a powerful lens into how therapeutic relationships begin deteriorating. Hindering events are moments within therapy that clients experience as emotional injuries or disconnecting or invalidating or trust eroding. And importantly, many hindering events appear relatively small from the outside. A therapist may glance repeatedly at the clock while a client is trying to disclose something, or a rigid policy is enforced, or a therapist prematurely interprets trauma before enough safety exists. There could be a subtle cultural microaggression that the therapist doesn't even realize they're making. A therapist may insist on an interpretation that does not fit the client's lived experience. Or a therapist may respond with clinical language when emotional presence was needed. So individually, these moments may appear minor, but psychologically, they can carry enormous weight, especially for clients with developmental trauma or attachment wounds, histories of chronic emotional invalidation, because therapy is not merely informational. The therapy room becomes a place where clients unconsciously ask, will my emotional reality be recognized here? Do I need to edit myself to stay connected? Will my vulnerability be met with responsiveness or dismissal? And when the answer repeatedly feels like dismissal, clients often stop bringing their authentic emotional experience into the room. Some become compliant, some intellectualize, some emotionally disappear. Some remain physically present in therapy while psychologically withdrawing from it completely, and others just leave altogether. One of the most painful aspects of therapeutic failure is that it can mirror the very relational injuries clients originally came to therapy to heal. For many trauma survivors, the deepest wounds were not created by isolated events alone. They were created by chronic emotional environments where the person's inner reality was repeatedly ignored, minimized, punished, pathologized, or misunderstood. Children develop their sense of self through relational mirroring. When caregivers respond to emotion with attunement, empathy, and responsiveness, the child learns, my internal experience matters. My emotions make sense. I can remain connected while being myself fully. But when emotional experiences are repeatedly dismissed, shamed, or neglected, the child often learns the opposite. They begin abandoning parts of themselves in order to preserve attachment. And unfortunately, these same attachment dynamics can quietly reappear inside therapy. If a therapist only validates the easy, compliant, high-functioning, or intellectualized parts of the client while becoming defensive, dismissive, overwhelmed, emotionally absent, or rigid when grief or shame or neurodivergence or trauma or relational complexity emerge, the client may experience therapy as another attachment injury, another environment where authenticity threatens connection, another relationship where emotional needs become too much. This is why unrepaired misattunement can become trauma reenactment. The therapy room stops feeling like a restorative microsystem and instead begins replicating older relational environments of emotional neglect or invalidation. And for many clients, this reenactment is not always consciously recognized. It's felt in the nervous system as exhaustion or dread or emotional shutdown or hopelessness, as the growing belief that therapy itself may not be safe enough to hold them. One of the most important distinctions in psychotherapy research is the difference between a rupture and an unrepaired rupture. Ruptures themselves are inevitable. Misunderstandings happen, emotional tension happens, and disappointment happens. Moments of disconnection happen. In fact, meaningful therapy almost guarantees periods of relational strain. The problem is not the existence of rupture. The problem is the absence of repair. Healthy therapeutic relationships are not relationships without conflict. They are relationships where conflict can be acknowledged, explored, metabolized, and repaired without abandonment, rejection, or defensiveness. But when therapists cannot tolerate feedback, uncertainty, relational complexity, or their own imperfection, rupture often becomes frozen. The therapist may double down on interpretations or become overly clinical or withdraw emotionally. They may pathologize the client's reactions or blame it on the client being resistant. They may subtly pressure the client into protecting the therapist's self-image. And once rupture becomes chronically unrepaired, alliance deterioration accelerates. The client begins adapting to the therapist rather than the therapist adapting responsively to the client. At that point, the alliance often becomes psychologically unsustainable, not because the client failed therapy, but because the relationship could no longer safely hold emotional truth. Not all therapeutic failure looks dramatic. Sometimes therapy does not collapse outwardly. Sometimes it slowly freezes. This is stagnation. Clients continue attending sessions, conversations continue, insight may even continue, but emotionally the process stops moving. The same conversations repeat, the same patterns recycle. Sessions begin feeling emotionally flat, disconnected, overly intellectualized, or quietly hopeless. And often, both therapist and client can sense it, but neither fully names it. Research suggests that some clients remain in therapy for long periods with little meaningful improvement, and in some cases, gradual deterioration. This can happen for many reasons. Sometimes the therapist remains overly passive in order to preserve harmony. Sometimes the therapist lacks the flexibility to shift their approach. Sometimes the client does not yet feel safe enough to risk vulnerability. And sometimes both therapist and client become trapped in a mutually protective relational dance that avoids the deeper emotional material entirely. Interestingly, therapists themselves may begin withdrawing emotionally during stagnation. Repeated experiences of feeling ineffective can evoke anxiety, shame, helplessness, or self-doubt within the therapist. And without sufficient self-awareness, the therapist may unconsciously protect themselves by becoming more detached, more procedural, or more emotionally unavailable. Exactly when deeper presence is most needed. Stagnation is painful because it often creates the illusion of therapy without the experience of transformation. The relationship continues, but the emotional engagement disappears. Therapy dropout is often framed within mental health systems as evidence of client resistance, lack of motivation, or treatment noncompliance. But the research tells a far more complicated story. Many clients who leave therapy report experiences of invalidation, emotional disconnection, lack of responsiveness, therapist rigidity, or feeling fundamentally misunderstood. Others describe therapy that became overly problem-focused without sufficient emotional attunement, or therapy that validated pain intellectually while failing to provide meaningful relational guidance, emotional presence, or practical movement. And importantly, dropout is not always pathological. Sometimes leaving therapy is an act of psychological self-protection, a client recognizing this relationship no longer feels emotionally safe, and I'm repeatedly leaving sessions feeling unseen. I don't think this therapist can meet me where I am. In these cases, leaving may actually represent increased agency, boundary formation, or self-trust. This does not mean all discomfort in therapy is harmful. Deep therapy is often uncomfortable, but there's a difference between discomfort that emerges within a fundamentally safe relationship and discomfort that emerges because the relationship itself has become emotionally unsafe, invalidating, or incapable of repair. And ethically, the mental health field can become more willing to differentiate those experiences. Even when therapy has been difficult, strained, or imperfect, endings matter profoundly. Healthy termination is not abrupt abandonment. It is a collaborative, intentional process that helps consolidate growth while preserving the client's sense of dignity, agency, and relational continuity. Ethically grounded termination involves openly discussing the ending process rather than quietly drifting away from it. It includes reflecting on progress, acknowledging unresolved areas honestly, preparing for future stressors, and helping clients identify supportive relationships and resources outside of therapy. Importantly, healthy termination also allows room for complexity. A client may feel grateful and disappointed simultaneously. They may feel ready and uncertain, connected and sad. And a therapist capable of holding that emotional complexity without defensiveness models something deeply important. Relationships can end without emotional erasure. One particularly beautiful concept within termination literature is the idea of an open door, the recognition that therapy is not always a permanent goodbye. Sometimes people return during later life transitions, losses, or periods of renewed struggle. And framing termination this way can reduce shame while reinforcing autonomy. You're not being abandoned. You're leaving with tools, insight, and the option for future support if needed. At its healthiest, termination becomes not the collapse of dependency, but the strengthening of internal capacity. As we close today's episode, perhaps the most important takeaway is this. Therapy does not become healing simply because it is professional. Degrees alone do not create safety. Techniques alone do not create transformation. Insight alone does not create attachment repair. The relationship matters, and more specifically, the responsiveness within the relationship matters. A therapist's willingness to remain flexible, to listen beneath the words, to tolerate feedback, to acknowledge misattunement and repair rupture, to adapt rather than rigidly impose, to prioritize the client's emotional reality over the therapist's own need to feel competent or correct. These are not secondary skills. They are foundational clinical ethics, because ultimately therapy succeeds or fails not only through intervention, but through whether the relationship itself becomes emotionally survivable, whether it becomes a place where clients can remain psychologically present without abandoning themselves, whether it becomes a space where vulnerability is met with responsiveness instead of neglect, and whether the alliance can hold emotional truth without collapsing under the weight of it. Thank you for listening to this episode of If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship.